There are very few experiencers of the supernatural that get all the credit they deserve when it comes to ET contact. One of those who is taken very seriously is Samantha Mowat. You may not be familiar with her name, but many in the UFO extraterrestrial community are. But her story is very real. Welcome to Beyond Humanity. Samantha Mowat has been an experiencer her entire life, experiencer of ET contact since she was a child. Her story runs through contact to government programs that are not for the faint of heart. Samantha, thank you so much for joining us on Beyond Humanity. How are you?
I'm good, Dave. Thank you for having me.
I want to be very upfront and present with everybody who may not have seen previous interviews that you and I have done on Spaced Out Radio, but you are an actual friend of mine. We've known each other since 2014, and
Mhm.
literally 25 minutes after you and I met, we actually had an ET experience, which is just absolutely phenomenal. And I will recommend people go to your own YouTube channel if they want to see that 40 some minute piece that we did, Samantha Mowat on YouTube. But Samantha, being a lifelong experiencer of the supernatural, it's not normal for a lot of people on this planet. Yet for you, it's very normal. Tell us
Mhm.
about what it's like having to have a life of contact.
Well, Dave, when people think about contact with extraterrestrials and multidimensionals, they think of it as being done only on a physical capacity. You can have contact ranging from psychic contact to astral contact to physical contact. And one thing that I recommend for a lot of people who are really just starting to get into ufology and understand the way in which it happens is when you are someone who's going through contact like myself, these beings come and go all throughout your entire life from the time you're born all the way through till death. You can see them and you go to sleep at night. Sometimes you'll see them when you're making pancakes for your kids in the morning. Sometimes you'll walk around a corner and be like, oh my goodness, there was a being inside my daughter's room. Or you'll see craft when you're driving down the highway. It's pretty common for people who are like myself to go through contact and to have these beings interjecting in normal parts of our lives. And one thing that I've noticed with it is that when you are having this contact, it doesn't happen in the way that people who don't experience contact understand. They think every time a craft will land in your backyard, a being will pop out of the craft, walk up the front door, take you out of the house that way, but that's not always how it goes. Contact can happen when you're being taken through an orb in through the house. You could walk through a vortex. You can end up being taken, lifted up out of your home. Sometimes the beings will just pop in for various reasons to see you or other members of your family. It's much more complex and rich than what people typically understand, and I'm very grateful to have it.
You are someone who is, like I said in the intro, one of the contactees out there that people in our community take very seriously. Why do you think your story manifests so much as reality for a lot of people who may not be experiencers, but put you on that pedestal to be one of those that we can believe?
I think because the majority of my contact has happened in ways that isn't as necessarily as like outlandish as what a lot of people expect. So when I share my contact experiences with people, I have no problem talking about the fact that I could be watching a movie with my children and then see a being walking across the room, or we may end up going camping and then having beings come to see us then. I'm willing to share the experiences that I have that are very personal and dear to my heart, things that I'm not always necessarily as comfortable sharing, but help to humanize and normalize contact by taking the normal everyday family aspect of it and sharing it with the world, which makes it very difficult. And a lot of other contactees aren't necessarily in a position where they feel safe to do that. Yet, because of the beings that I work with, they have expressed that this is necessary for people to better understand how contact works and how it affects people on a multi generational level. And that's part of why I think it's more resonating for people. Go ahead, Dave.
Well, one of the things that I have noticed is I would put you in that
Mhm.
category of Chris Bledsoe and the Bledsoe family, or Travis Walton, Betty and Barney Hill, people of
Mhm.
that ilk, because your story is one where it's taken you on such a diverse level compared to just having lights come down in the sky from when you're driving your car. And get taken away. I mean, yours is a little bit more impactful and hands-on comparatively to many others outside of the Bledsoe family. So for you being a part of that community, you know, I guess what I'm trying to get at here is many people who look into the UFO community look at experiencers as very judgmental. People are very judgmental, and I realize you have your critics, I have my critics. We're all going to have those people who do not believe. But for the
Mhm.
majority of experiencers out there, they have a heck of a time trying to really get embraced by the community by telling their story. Yet for someone like you or the Bledsoes, it has been relatively, your stories have been relatively believable. Why do you think the UFO community has such a contrast with what they believe and what they don't?
With the majority of my contact, I try to share as much of the information as possible, even when it doesn't necessarily put me in a good light. Well, for instance, if I feel contact where I'm having a situation with whether it's with the Greys, the reptilians, humanoids, where it feels fearful, or let's say it feels very compassionate and love based, the fact that I'm willing to share a lot of the more vulnerable aspects, I think some people leave out, may make it so their stories and their experiences are harder for people to have resonate with them because they're omitting crucial parts of evidence and information relevant to the encounters that they're sharing. I think that's definitely a strong component of it. But this is also what I'm meant to be doing. I have the beings that I'm working with. They're the ones who told me that this is what they need me to do. This is part of my soul's mission on this planet, is to normalize contact and psychic abilities. And so they are the ones who are assisting to help me to better reach people as well. And I think that does contribute. Go ahead.
Do you think that the reason why they chose you was because you have that inner strength to deal with the criticisms, deal with the negativity that follows everybody in this field?
To an extent, yes, but it's also a soul agreement that I made prior to coming down here.
Okay. So for people who may not understand, what do you mean by a soul agreement?
So, prior to incarnation, we tend to make contracts in place about things that we are going to accomplish within any given lifetime. You may be here to clear up karma. You might agree to, in your case, work with the media to help make ufology, cryptozoology, and all these things more normalized. In my case, it's to make psychic abilities and extraterrestrials and multidimensionals on a more understandable and human nature. So, you'll make these agreements with a lot of the beings that you work with and the people that you'll be incarnating with of, okay, I'm going to be of assistance with you and help raise you, for instance, my children, to be more psychically inclined. I'm going to help you with your contact. Whereas with you and I was you and I would have a soul agreement for me to be with you when you had your first very strong in-person ET experience outside of the other one that you had happen at the farm, where it was at a safer distance, per se. And so that would be helping you with your awakening. We have contracts like that in place with various people, as well as various contracts in place with a lot of the beings. In this situation, I have a soul contract with many of the different races to help make it so they are more understood by humanity by showing them in a different light, helping to take, for instance, the Greys, which are often perceived as being a very cold, scientific, not necessarily approachable race, and helping to show the humanity within them and the diversity within their culture and their ways of being. That's part of what I mean.
Okay, so do you ever sit there and wonder why were you chosen to do this outside of the soul agreement? Because many people who look inside of this are very nuts and bolts. They're very
Mhm.
alphabetic in the way they perceive ET contact, going to the whole soul entity and unit and divine consciousness along those lines. Many people in this community have troubles understanding that. So for you, when you look at it, because you're fighting an uphill battle in bringing some sort of credibility to this field, you really can only take it one person at a time, because for many out there, they're not going to be able to believe what you are saying because they can't
Mhm.
understand that factor.
And I agree that, yes, for a lot of people, part of what I go through and the combination of psychic abilities in conjunction with extraterrestrial multidimensional contact is very difficult for them to understand. But I'm not necessarily here to help those people. I'm here to help the humans that are going through the awakening process, the new children, the indigos, the star seeds, the earth angels, the beings that are starting to awaken to the multidimensional nature of reality, helping them to understand the complexity of what is going on. And so when those other people are at a state where they are more capable of understanding the diversity of life within the universe, that is more so when they will start to understand the information that people such as myself and many others are bringing to the center of this I guess, platform. It's not that I was necessarily chosen to do this. It was I was asked to do this. They asked that I do this for them. I'm not alone in this. There are actually thousands of people like me doing the exact same thing. So this is by no means a matter of being special or chosen. It's just simply a you're qualified for the job. We need you to do this. And therefore, will you please do it? And I agreed
It sounds so symptomatic the way you put it, though.
because it is symptomatic. We're complicating things unnecessarily.
Define that for me, for people who may not understand.
When we think about our incarnations and we think about the fact like most of us are having trouble understanding the fact that we could have multiple incarnations, let alone thinking about the fact that we are energy, which is a soul, and we are having multiple lifetimes all across the universe. We are not just limited to being here. Yes, we have incarnations for many of us throughout all ages of Earth history, but when you start to look beyond that and you start to understand how your soul can have incarnations in the various star systems on different dimensional planes, ranging from the high vibrational angelic planes, cascading down through to the Pleiadians, the Reptilians, the Greys, the Sumerians, or not Sumerians, pardon me, the Atlanteans, working through all these different energetic fields, you start to recognize that your soul is much more complex than what people understand. And it's because the beings that I work with, in particular the Pleiadians, who help me to understand my psychic abilities, that as I'm encountering people on a one-on-one or at a UFO conference or talking to them in readings, that I can give them points of information to help them understand that what I'm saying in regards to these other areas is more accurate. Because I will talk to their angels, their spirit guides, and their soul family and ask them, hey, what does this person need to know? What are they going through right now? Tell me what habits they have been going through and what is coming up for them in the future so they can understand the other messages about them being a star seed, in particular their soul origin, are more authentically based so they have more understanding. And so we think about all of this and we're like, wow, it's my job to awaken humanity. And we're making it out to be some really big thing, when in actuality, our jobs are typically very small. We're a very small piece of the puzzle, each doing our own little bit to make a big change. And so I do think that we make it more complex unnecessarily.
Samantha Mowat is here on Beyond Humanity tonight. Samantha, in regards to who you are and the way you've been brought up, this has been very normal for you as a
Mhm.
process of getting to learn many different species of extraterrestrial contact and learning something that the majority of humanity has not awakened to. You know, when you look at your overall life and this path that you chose, do you find it is more difficult to be who you are comparatively to what the rest of the world is?
No, I think mine's actually a lot easier. I have a very good idea of where my soul has been, who I have been over numerous incarnations. If I have difficulty with anything from finances to people to absolutely anything in life, I simply ask the beings I work with to be of assistance. And my life is actually much easier because of it. And that's part of what the beings that I work with have tried to explain to me and countless others is that by asking for assistance from the higher vibrational realms, our lives are actually much simpler because there are many beings operating just out of the realm of sight that are able to be of assistance to us that we are helping as well. And so I think a normal person who's working a 9 to 5 job, who is not awakened, actually has a much more difficult time going through life because they have this sense within their soul, this understanding that things aren't quite right, that something in their life isn't resonating, that doesn't have meaning. And they feel as though there's this yearning for more and they are suffering through depression, anxiety, addictions of drugs, alcohol, caffeine, television, technology, where they're looking for meaning, but they can't seem to find it. Whereas I'm coming at from the opposite perspective because of what I've been raised with and because of what I've gone through. I don't seem to have those same almost like restrictions in place because I've worked past a lot of those things. And so I actually find this to be much easier from an awakened perspective than from the perspective of someone who's unawakened at this time. But they will awaken with time. I should mention that as well.
Your story is so incredible, the way you have been able to really enlighten yourself through your years of doing this literally since childhood. You know, for many who are just awakening now and trying to understand the whole plot of what's happening to them, myself included, as I have worked with you for the last almost 7 years here, my question to you is, for those who are just awakening to this entire phenomena of ET contact, because maybe it's just happened to them, or maybe they're realizing it's just happening to them, what advice do you give people who are new to this and this experience?
There's a few points of advice I think are the most critical for anyone who is new to ufology in particular. The first of which being discernment. There's a whole load of information out there about every single type of being, be it reptilian, Pleiadian, Procyon, you name it, Anunnaki. And I want for you, as you're going through the information that you're encountering on YouTube, in books and radio podcasts, to actually use your true intuition. And as you're hearing things, you will hear some things about some of the species that resonates with you and others that does not resonate with you. And you have to look at it from your place of understanding. If someone says to you that one race, for instance, the Pleiadian, is all good, and you feel as though that energy feels off, then trust your intuition, because no one race within any of the different extraterrestrial multidimensional races, angels included, is purely good. And that people need to understand. And the same can be said with being purely bad. We have to look at things from a very logical and methodical place of understanding that these beings, just like us, are not gods. They are simply more psychically evolved than us. They have better technology than us. That doesn't mean they are better than us. That simply means that they come at a place of advantage. And so we must take that into consideration as well. I also wish for people who are going through this to recognize that there are a lot of disinformation campaigns out there about all of the species, many of which put you into a place of fear. And as you're going through this, if you encounter something that feels very heavy, very intense, I want you to just pull back from what you're researching for a day or two and stop and let the information kind of sit with you. Does it resonate? Or am I looking at this newfound information from a place of fear, from a perspective of anxiety? In which case, you need to look at the information and recognize that there is something to it that your intuition is saying isn't quite accurate, and to look at it again from a clearer perspective. Third of which is meditation is very important. If you wish to have contact with many of these beings, in particular on an astral level, a psychic level, or in a physical level, as is the capacity with you, Dave, which is what you're yearning for, meditation is key, because you have to learn how to calm your mind in order to have clear telepathic information with these beings, because the majority of which are telepathic. They are not necessarily as verbal as we are. If you have a mantis being show up in front of you, it's not going to be using its adorable little mouth to talk to you. It's going to be telepathic communication. And so you do have to learn how to calm your mind and to get out of that fear state to really have clear communication with these beings. And that's very necessary as you're just going through the awakening process, is to recognize that.
Samantha, so many times we hear that the nuts and bolts scientific side of this, that it's impossible for ETs to already be here because we can only think about our own level of advancement on what we've accomplished here on the planet. And let's face it, outside of sending satellites and rovers outside to places like Mars or the other sides of the universe, Jupiter, Saturn, the other planets, we really haven't accomplished much. So for you, in all of your contact experiences and from what you have learned in talking to people over the years, how do you define how all of these different species that you claim to have contact with are getting here?
Well, depending upon their level of consciousness and their level of technology, that determines a lot about how they come to see us. Many of the beings that we're perceiving to be extraterrestrial are, in fact, actually multidimensional, indicating that they're not necessarily from this universe, but from one that's operating on a frequency very similar to our own and crossing over the threshold over to this universe. For instance, they will use things such as many of their craft are able to travel between this dimension and others, indicating that they will use things such as orbs. They will use things like vortexes, where they split two areas in time and space. For instance, Dave, if I were on an ET craft right now, I could open up a vortex between my wall right here beside me and the room that you are in, step over through that very simple door, in a sense, between the two locations, come get you and take you. And that is part of how they end up doing it, is they're actually bending time and space and creating almost like cuts in time and space and then repairing them. That's part of what this is. Now, when people think about this, they think of it as just being a very, I have to have a craft, and the Pleiades are this many millions or trillions of miles away, and therefore you can't do that as quickly. And you have to remember, a lot of these beings don't necessarily work in the same way that we do. the dimensions that they're coming from, they have technology that's up to millions of years more advanced than our own. And so many of them actually use light ships. When it comes to the Greys, their technology does seem to be a lot less advanced than a lot of the other ones. When I've been on plating and craft, they seem to be more alive, as though their craft are comprised of energy, grown in a sense, more like a Merkaba or like a light ship, rather than being more nuts and bolts. If you were to have a light ship crash, it would not be in the same physical debris like you would see with an airplane crash here, which would be more akin to what you'd see if you were to knock down the craft of a tall white or a gray. Theirs would have more nuts and bolts. And so people have to take that into consideration as we're dealing with a large variety of beings that are able to interact with us and that have an interest in working with humanity. But it isn't just purely on their own selfless intentions. May these beings have an invested interest in humans, whether it's through hybridization or contracts or because we're their distant soul families, things of that nature, as well as helping the star seeds that they have incarnating on this planet as well, keeping them healthy and things of that nature.
How do you get your information? Because you're someone, and let's disclose it. You don't have a post secondary education.
Nope.
You know, you're not a scientist. You're not
Nope.
someone who should have the knowledge of all of this stuff that you do. Where do you get this information from?
The beings I work with, I talk to them, whether it's through channeling or whether it's through when I'm up on craft. They don't work with me in a standard sense. What people think about when they think about someone who's educated on all these things, every time I tried to go to university, I got pregnant. They're like, we're not letting you go to school. We're not letting you become a doctor. We're not letting you become a scientist. We're not letting you become a dentist or a politician this lifetime. We need for you not to be programmed in that standard sense. Because as soon as you start going to these schools, they actually teach you how to think and they teach you how to stop asking questions. They actually deprogram you, pardon me, out of your light, so to speak. Because when we go to school, it's actually a very restricted way of teaching us how to think, how to process, how to do deductive reasoning. And so that's part of the reason why the beings I work with would not allow for myself to go to university, despite me being accepted into the universities that I applied for, which I did find very disappointing. But what they want for you to understand with this, Dave, is when you're looking at anything, it doesn't matter whether it's to do with marine biology, animals, whether it has to do with health sciences, whether it has to do with your own media or things like quantum physics, it does not matter. We're all tapping into that natural collective thought field. Anyone can do it. And that's part of the reason why a lot of these beings are working with us, to understand our psychic abilities, how to have telepathic understanding. Psychic abilities are nothing new. They are something that is actually very natural to humanity. And that's part of what they're trying to get us all back to. We're all very psychic beings. Look at your own children, for instance. They are profoundly more psychic than we were at their age. And with each generation, we are becoming more psychic. And that is because of the evolution of consciousness that is occurring. And this is being recognized all across the board, whether it's my clients that are working as teachers, as scientists, as doctors. They've all come to me and talked about the fact that they are recognizing that these new children are on a whole nother level than what our generations were, because they are more tuned in. They're not as easily deprogrammed from their light. And that's why we're seeing a whole level of diversity coming forward as far as these conditions are concerned. Things like autism, ADD, different ways of having the brain rewired and reprogrammed, because they're not as easily put into the catatonic program state that we were, which I think is absolutely incredible. And that's part of what these beings are working with, is they're actually altering many of the humans for many generations. Now they do typically follow bloodlines. And what they're doing is actually helping the humans that they're working with to stay more capable of understanding their information. So when I say their information, I'm talking about things like recognizing through a discernment level what is correct and what isn't correct. Because we are, as a collective, waking up to the programs in place, whether it's you go to school, then you go to university, and then you get married, then you get the job, and then you get the house, and that's your life, 9 to 5, then you die. And they're actually trying to get us out of that program state that we were in, feeling like that was the idea of success. They're actually helping us to connect into more of the other star systems ways of understanding. Make sense?
What's the purpose of wanting to have that different connection?
So the purpose behind wanting to have that different connection actually has to do with preparation for contact with these other diverse beings. In order for us to have disclosure on a proper level where we're willing to actually accept many of the extraterrestrial multidimensional races, we have to be more diverse and willing to accept diversity within our own collective species. Right now, we are struggling with everything from classism to racism, sexism, and prejudice on every possible angle. And part of what they're trying to do at this time is actually dismantle the program beliefs that we have in place. One of the ones that they've been working very hard with in particular has to do with religion and religious understanding. And so they're very pro spiritual. They're not necessarily as religiously focused. That is part of what they're doing in order to help us have more conscious, one on one, everyday humans seeing these beings walking amongst us. Because if you were to have beings coming in front of you, Dave, for instance, right now, you'd be able to handle having a gray come up to you, like, hi, my name's so and interacting with you. But Joe down the street couldn't handle that. If they saw a gray coming up to them, walking up to them at like the supermarket, grocery parking lot, pardon me, they would probably try to shoot it or hit it or run from it. And that's part of what they're trying to do, is dismantle the belief systems that we have in place, not only around beauty, but also about what is good and what is bad. That is part of what they're working towards at this time.
You have had police officers,
Mhm,
politicians, scientists,
mhm,
mathematicians, teachers of all,
mhm,
and people of all ilk reach out to you
mhm.
regarding your opinion about their own personal contact and or why are things happening the way they are. Why do you think over the last number of years people of societal positioning, shall we say, have started reaching out to you to learn more about the potential of ET contact?
Because they're recognizing within their soul that there's so much more going on than what we're being taught about. Many of these people, when they were in their teens, their 20s, their 30s, they were not necessarily awake. But now, a lot of them, especially as we look to the older generations that are really starting to wake up, everything from millennials to Generation X to the boomers and all the way back, they're actually starting to recognize that the things that they were taught are no longer resonating. And so they're looking outside of themselves to try to find answers, which is completely fine, but they're searching in everything from YouTube to, of course, psychics to books to these conferences to really try to gain an awareness because they can feel within their own soul resonance that's what we have been taught isn't quite accurate. And so they're looking for external validation of things that they already know on a soul level, which I think is quite wonderful.
For you, do you have an example or a personal story you could share regarding the beings telling you about the way they are trying to shape the world?
Mm, Probably. One of the ones I think is actually most relevant is when I was a teenager, I was going on to craft quite often. I was going on to craft and meeting Palladians in particular. And what they were doing is they were trying to help me better understand energy, vibration, and frequency. And now part of the reason why they're trying to do this was they're trying to help me better understand the vibratory resonance being emitted by people, being emitted by information, being emitted by a lot of various components. And the reason behind doing this was actually to help me understand when I was encountering information, how to discern it better, how to recognize when it did or did not resonate. And so, even when I look at things that are going on today, whether I'm watching the news on my phone or I'm talking to a client and they're trying to talk to me about one thing or another, sometimes you'll have these beings coming forward. For instance, I will have sometimes people that have attachments onto their energetic field, which an attachment is when you have a lower vibrational entity that's actually feeding off of the aura and putting that person into a negative state. For instance, a person could be addicted to anger, complaining, sex, drugs, alcohol, television, things of that nature. And so sometimes, if you are not careful, psychics will end up reading into the energy of the attachment because the attachment can pretend to be an angel or spirit guide. And what these beings did was they taught me how to better recognize the vibratory difference between an angelic being, a spirit guide, a soul family, so on and so forth, as well as the attachments to help me better correlate the information. And so as I started to recognize the vibratory frequencies, they actually helped me to be able to recognize when my clients or even my friends, my family are going through these things. And that is also a skill that they've kind of passed over towards the other areas of my life. And so that's part of the reason when I go up on craft, for instance, Dave, especially if it's a new species, if they notice that I'm going through a lot of my triggered states lately, for instance, having a lot of MILAB encounters, having a lot of MK Ultra programming going on, or being triggered by some of my triggers, then I can react very like hostile type fashion when I go up onto craft. And so sometimes the beings will end up putting on the wrong appearance. And so I'll recognize, hey, look, you're not my aunt, you're not my friend. And I will get very aggressive with them because I recognize that they're being dishonest with me, despite the fact that they will look clear as day as the person that they're intending to look. I'll recognize the vibratory frequency isn't right. And so the reason why I'm bringing this part up is as we're looking at everything, you have to look at these beings with the intention that they have in place, which is okay, we are trying to talk to her. We're trying to pick someone that we know she finds to be a safe person, but they're also recognizing that they couldn't necessarily come to me if I'm in a triggered state. from some of my programming and appear as an ET because I couldn't react negatively based on some of my MILAB programming. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and but the point is, I guess that I'm trying to
Mhm.
get at is a lot of
Yeah.
people who hear your story and are trying to maybe come to terms with what you're going through and how you've been able to approach it. They may not feel consciously aware of what is truly going on because of the whole scientific genre that is
Mhm.
really telling us, like right now, if you look deep into the UFO field, we're allowed to talk about UFOs, we're not allowed to talk about ET contact. So that actually leads to another question here, Samantha. You know, I know you're not somebody who keeps up on the news. You do your own thing. You're somebody who isn't really interested in what's happening on a governmental level or anything like that. So why do you think society today is really trying to push a divide between what UFOs are comparatively to what extraterrestrials are?
Well, it's one thing to admit that there are UFOs out there. Because if you do that, you were keeping them at arm's length. You were saying, yes, there is a life in the universe, but they're not necessarily interacting with us. They're just kind of watching us. They're just kind of checking in or doing their own thing. But as soon as things such as the government start to admit that there are extraterrestrials, in particular the different races, as other countries have, as has our Honorable Paul Hellyer, former Defense Minister of Canada, and several other countries around the world showing UFOs on their nightly news, you start to actually shift the way humanity is understanding it, in particular large areas and large collectives, be it the United States or Canada. Neither government does seem to be terribly willing to acknowledge the ET aspect despite having their own evidence in place. And if you start to talk about the fact that there are people that are being contacted, as soon as you admit that, people will wonder, well, who's contacting them? Why are they contacting them? How long have they been here? And that's a lot of questions that they're not necessarily prepared to answer and that they're not necessarily wanting to answer at this time because you do have to have a lot of control over people in order to release that information in a way that majority of people can handle. If you think about the standard person who's in their teens, 20s, 30s, they're more likely to be accepting of UFO contact and the beings that are out there than, say, someone in their 70s, 80s, and 90s who would have grown up with a more religious and dogmatic lifestyle, who may not necessarily have the same understanding of how the universe is necessarily impacting us and how these beings have been coming for a long time, because that is a lot of cognitive dissonance built into those people. And so I can see how they are biding their time, trying to do it in a way in which these people are more comfortable with and at a time that's most appropriate. I do think disclosure should happen. I would love to see it happen soon, not necessarily for my benefit, but for the benefit of other people who are going through contact so they can get the medical help that they need, because there's a lot of PTSD that goes along with it for most people.
Okay, for people who may not have heard you speak before, they may be
Mhm.
looking at this basically saying, you know, you're someone who really looks at this entire subject from a real peace, light, love, and light, and all aliens are good and everything like that. But
No.
you have had your negative experiences as well, not only with the beings themselves, but through government programs of MK Ultra and MILABS as well. But let's focus right now on the negative aspect of ET contact, not because it's the most popular, but because it is a reality of what you go through. Because I don't think a lot of people understand that when you're an ET contactee, it's like shooting a beacon of light deep up into the sky, and everybody can pick up on that beacon of light that's flying by.
Well, how about I share with you something that has happened very recently that is actually a negative aspect of ET contact without blaming any race in particular. Last week, I was actually pregnant with three hybrid children. I had three embryos that were going within me. My breasts were sore. I had nausea. I had feelings of pregnancy. Women know when they're pregnant. And I did have sex with one of the people I have orchestrated relationships with 2 weeks before that. And that was completely fine. I converged with him. I talked to him like, hey, we had sex on craft. Do you remember this? He said, yes. We exchanged information because quite often, if you're very lucky, you will get to meet the people in person that you're going through orchestrated relationships with and hybridization with. And shortly after, I end up having these beings come and take the three embryos from me. They were developing, they were quite healthy. And I felt as though there was this void in my uterus. I had an exceptionally heavy period. Sorry for the TMI. But the part of it that actually made things very difficult was I had a week long migraine between last weekend to this weekend, where my head felt like it was going to explode. The reason why it ended up having this fluctuation is when you're going on to craft, if you are not being properly taken care of all the time, then you are going to have too much of a pressure change, in particular if you're on craft for a long period of time, because the pressure that is being emitted onto the body and onto the brain in particular is very different than the pressure that's necessarily happening on the body when you're on planet Earth. And so it's a very minute difference between the two, but when you're exposed to it long enough, it's very similar to like getting the bends or like having going deep sea diving where you go to a deep pressure. If you come back too quickly and you do not give yourself proper time to acclimatize, then you are going to have repercussions upon the physical body afterwards. And so that is one of the things that had happened. It threw off my clairvoyance. It made it very difficult for me to see things clearly, and I had to reschedule all my readings for the week for later dates. But the problem that I had with this was I was going through feelings of nausea. My vision was disrupted. I was having such a bad migraine that I felt like I was going to throw up and pass out. I literally went to the emergency room because I couldn't handle the pain anymore. And that is one aspect of contact that many people do not discuss, in particular if they're going through things like hybridization. The other side of it is you can go through things where you are having sexual partners. You can have some of them when you go up on craft where you see them, where you end up breeding with them, which can actually be very difficult because it can cause two people to become very connected to one another, or for one person to be very connected, or for you to end up being abused sexually by some of the ET beings, because there are varieties of hybrid that are not necessarily as kind, that are able to breed with humans, get us pregnant, or take our sperm if we are males and become pregnant by us as well, things of that nature. I have been raped by one variety of reptilian, which I really did have a hard time getting past and gave me a lot of anxiety. Dave, you remember me after Hawaii, how emotional and erratic I was that one episode of SOR. So there are things like that that take place.
Okay, but what about on a more human level with getting involved with MK Ultra? How did you
Mhm.
first learn about MK Ultra and then find out that you were actually being used for this?
I found out about it when I was in my MILAB experiences, when they were actually showing me images and joking, because one of the handlers that I have was joking about how they had been programming me and using sex as one of the things as my triggers. They were having certain sexual positions that he was talking about, how they would use them with me in a certain sequential order to take me in and out of program states. And that made me throw up when I learned that, because it was just too much for me to end up learning at that time. They end up showing me a series of my triggers because they were trying to see what ones I could recognize, which ones I could remember, as a form of sadistic way of trying to understand more of what was going on. When people look at things like MKUltra, they think it's all just happening in Hollywood or in LA, and they're completely wrong about that. They are following very specific bloodline families, and they are also following people that have more advanced psychic abilities because they're trying to breed those into specific soldiers, in particular, their next generation ones. People think of things like MKUltra and they think of it's only happening for the use of the Illuminati or satanic rituals, and it's not just that. That is one component of it, but it also has to do with the secret space program as well.
Okay, so when you go through an MK Ultra experience, which is still a highly controversial program
Mhm.
that is talked about but has never been 100% confirmed, you know,
Mhm.
what happens during that? Are you taken much like an ET experience, or do you have people coming knocking on your door and saying, "Hey, you better come with me"? How does that work?
Quite typically, it is black triangular shaped UFOs that come to get me that have red or white lights at the end points of the UFO. Normally, it is done through abduction and craft rather than someone coming with a white van and picking me up. I've found that on occasion, I will have white vans outside of my home that have picked up my family in the middle of the night when it comes to my MyLab programming and to do with my MyLab experiences. But when it comes to things like MKUltra, it is typically done through black triangular craft where they take you to deep underground bases.
Where are those bases located?
That's a good question. All I know is that they're not too far away. It doesn't feel like a long flight whenever I've gone. I would say, judging by what I'm going through, I would say northern BC is where one of them is.
Okay. So for people who may not recognize the difference between a MyLab and MK Ultra, what's the difference in the programs?
So a MILAB is a military abductee that is used for a number of different things. You have your super soldiers comprised under the MILAB component. You have people that have more psychic abilities that are legitimate ET contactees that are abducted and then interrogated about what the beings are teaching them, what it is they discussed, where they go, what beings are taking them, what is their intention, things of that nature. Quite often, a MILAB experience will happen shortly after a physical or intense astral experience. Almost all MILABs have implants within them that show when the people are taken off of their, like out of their home in the middle of the night, or if they're taken out of the world because their signal end up stop emitting, things of that nature. There's also a large energetic surge that tends to come when you have craft either over top of your home or orbs that are coming through, things like that. So it's quite common for people that are MILABs. I'll get into MKUltra in a minute. For MILABs to have, like, for instance, you'll have an ET experience and then you'll be put back from your ET experience. Then shortly after that night, you'll end up getting picked up by MILAB craft. And they will come, they will interrogate you. They will ask you who it was that took you. They will end up taking samples of your skin, your hair, your nails. Sometimes if they know I go through hybridization, they'll take samples of vaginal fluids, sorry for the TMI, things of that nature, because they're trying to better understand the genetic aspect. They also take samples of blood quite often as well. They do tend to put you in more of a catatonic type state. Sometimes if you're not willing to actually be willing to exchange information with them and share with them what they need, they will beat you, they will rape you, they will end up doing all sorts of horrendous things to you. They will also threaten your children if you have them, your loved ones, or even your pets. That is very common as well. Whereas an MK Ultra is a little bit different. Quite often, people that have gone through MK Ultra have actually been sexually assaulted at a very young age, typically done before the age of 5. Very commonly found in families that are either a bloodline or are of military type lineage and contactee as well. Because once you end up breaking the mind, you're able to compartmentalize it into several different components. What this ends up doing is when they abduct you, they will put you into one of your altars. An altar is an altered perspective. It's almost as though you switch from being one personality over to the other through the use of a symbolic representation, for instance, blue butterfly, yellow Volkswagen bug, as well as a series of code words. I'm not willing to share my code words. I've only figured out a couple of them, but every time I have heard them, they've put me into an altered state, and there's a very distinct personality switch. When you end up having things like MKUltra experiences going on, you will often be used for things like breeding. You will end up being a form of, in essence, an escort. Some of these ones, you can be escorted towards people that escort as in sexual escort towards people that are going through to the soldiers or to some of the higher ups that are there. It is a very sick and sadistic way because it actually changes your perspective. Quite often you don't remember a lot of these. They may come back to you in dream time through hypnosis or just having almost like when you're having something that triggers an experience that you've had. For instance, I can't watch movies where they show things about being raped or people being slammed up against walls because it gives me anxiety attacks and it gives me flashbacks of things that I've seen in my experiences, things like that. And that's a very common thing for MKUltra as well. There is also a very common aspect where they have difficulty when it comes to certain sexual acts. They'll either have like a fetish towards them or they'll have a complete abstinence towards them because they'll feel almost like more of a connection or a complete stain from them. Does that make sense? Yeah. Sorry for that being really heavy.
So the fact that you have experienced all of this, and especially MILABS and MK Ultra, this is something that is still a hidden byproduct of what we are going through. What do you think causes the government to know, or how do they know that you need to be included into these programs?
Normally, they are following bloodlines. So, what happens when you have a UFO craft? Most of them emit a stronger energetic signature. And because we do have a lot of not only satellites in the sky tracking energetic signatures, but we also have things all around us that are able to sense the vibratory fluctuation when they know that your family has been going through contact, as mine has for many, many generations. They do tend to track the bloodlines because they recognize that the ETs have taken a vested interest in these specific bloodlines, especially if your family has a history of military service. They also tend to recognize those as well. And the reason why I bring this part up is when your family has a history of military service, if they end up having contact while they're in deployment or anything like that, they are better able to recognize that these people need to be followed, in particular their children from birth, the same as when they get pregnant. And when they end up recognizing these things, some of the people, if you suddenly, let's say for instance, Dave, you are a normal human being, and let's say you're the first person in your family to ever have contact, but they recognize, like like the ETs and multidimensionals recognize that you're awakening and that you're starting to awaken to your soul heritage of being a starseed and being Anunnaki and things like that. And you're now typing into your Google search and everything else. Am I abducted by aliens? Is this happening? Or what are these beings? What are their intentions? Things like that. And you suddenly after a sudden course of never looking these things up, you're now obsessively looking at it. They're going to recognize that you're having contact, and they will, chances are, either start to monitor you, have someone remote view you and see if you're having contact, or they will end up abducting you when the next time they recognize there's an energetic fluctuation within your area and see if you were impacted or anyone else in your family was impacted. That is another way as well. As is the case with many of the starseeds that are coming in, being born to non-contactee and abductee families. That is part of how they're recognizing it, is when these children come in, they have such a strong energetic signature. If you start displaying a lot of strong psychic abilities, they are also recognizing that as well. They're also tracking the blood. So when I say tracking the blood, they're recognizing the higher levels of blood that is actually being inactivated DNA. So when we're
What are
looking
they
at
hoping to gain with it? Have you been told?
control. They're trying to actually slow down the evolution of consciousness, because as soon as humanity ends up having a breaking point, hitting the 100th monkey syndrome, where we all recognize that, yes, contact is happening. Yes, we're not actually from here, so on and so forth. There's life in the universe. These beings are interacting with us. It's game over for them. They're not able to have control over us in the way that they were. And so we're more capable in having our sovereignty returned back to us at that time.
So what we see going on with the planet today, does that have anything to do with what we're seeing with these MILABS and MK Ultra experiences that people such as yourself are going through?
Well, what do you mean when you say, what do we see going on with the planet
Well, when
today?
we see a planet that's in disruption, it's ergonomically, being terrorized. We see people not trusting people. We see governments not trusting people. We see a pandemic going on that people really don't know what's going on, or
But
whether it's been, you know,
that's all deliberate. That's a point to help keep them in a state where they're in that place of fear. If you keep people in the fear vibration, you're keeping them in the root chakra, in the sacral chakra, and you're not allowing for the energy of them to actually expand to the upper chakras, indicating that they're not allowing their kundalini to move forward. They're not allowing for the higher chakras to be activated. If you keep all of someone's energy within the fear vibration, the fear, sex, survival, which is your bottom three chakras, you're not going to have your psychic abilities of clear communication with your guides, seeing beyond reality and having the clear downloads. So your clairvoyance, your clairaudience, and things of that nature aren't going to come forward, which means you won't connect to your guides. You won't connect to these beings very easily. You won't access your telepathy, which makes it very hard for you to communicate with anything that would actually give you light and information about what is truly happening here. So it's all very deliberate. It's like a last minute attempt to try to keep people in that fear vibration. That's why they're pushing it so hard now, is because we're still awakening much faster than ever.
So for you personally, do you have secrets or stories or information that people in governmental or militaristic positions want?
Probably. They do interrogate me almost every time I go on my MyLab experiences. They often ask me about what these different beings want, and sometimes I end up giving it over to them very freely, because we're in a catatonic state. When you're in an altered state of awareness, you do tend to tell them the things that they are wanting to understand, because you can't help it. These things are programmed into you when you're in certain altars. Whether you want to be honest or not, you will be. And it's heartbreaking, but that is reality of the matter. And I don't think people understand that component.
Are these groups, are they connected to certain governments or militaries? I guess what I'm saying is this a world military that is doing this, or is this a United States or a Canadian military that's taking part in this?
There are several. You can look at them as being different factions and different places of understanding. The beings that you see interacting with the American military will be quite different than the ones you see interacting overall with the Chinese military or the Russian military, although the Canadian military are very closely aligned. Also, the British, and they'll be very highly interconnected. So that's part of where we look at things and see them as being very different. We do see a very strong reptilian control going on. Negative reptilians, not the good reptilians. There are good reptilians, so please make that distinction clear. But they are having their own agenda. Quite often when I have my MyLab experiences with the Canadian or the American type military, I do see reptilians in place as well. They are very thoroughly throughout these experiences. I've also seen grays with our military as well, when they're either changing my implants over or abducting me or doing things of that nature.
Do you believe that there is a galactic federation out there, much like the former head of the Israeli space security, Haim Shed, stated about a month ago, stating that there is a galactic federation up there that is not allowing a lot of ETs to make full contact with humans on the planet because they don't think humanity is ready?
Yes, I do believe there's a galactic federation, and the reason why I believe that is in one of my encounters of 4 or 5 years ago, I ended up speaking at one of them, begging on behalf of humanity for them to come and intervene. So, yes, I do believe there is one based upon one of my experiences.
So you don't think a story like that from, and there's been a couple of people now, Paul Hellyer has talked about it as well, that there is something more going on in space rather than what we see here on the planet.
Yes, that is correct. There's a lot more going on than what we understand. And that's one thing that I've noticed with a lot of the ETs that I end up working with is they do have a very strong interest in learning not only about humans and about Earth, but they want to understand the things that we see. Quite often they'll end up placing their hand either on my arm or on my shoulder to start to see things from my perspective, to have the psychic understanding that comes through on a clairsentient and empathic understanding, not only seeing what I'm seeing, but also feeling it as well, because what they're doing is they're trying to get a boots on the ground perspective as well, which I find to be really incredible.
Thank you so much for taking the time to do this, but I would be remiss if I didn't get into our own personal encounter, because you and I met on April 15th, 2014, and this was 5 days after I personally had a UFO landing happen right in front of me in communication with that craft. And I know that I was not of this world when it happened, pun intended, as it happened. But I remember when I met you that day, it was about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and we were gathering for tea. And this was something that I was, a little nervous about being there because I hadn't really slept in 5 days. And here it comes, this beautiful young, redheaded young lady who has a gamut of information regarding ET contact. And lo and behold, I have never doubted you since that day when we met, because you've become a very important person in my life, not only on an extraterrestrial side but on a personal side as well. When you have that type of contact with someone, it really changes you, and I am forever grateful for not only your friendship, but that I was able to experience what we experienced that day.
Me too, Dave. I mean, it was really nice to, even as I was going over to our mutual friend's house, to be able to feel the craft, knowing I was going to have an abduction or an encounter, pardon me, that day. And then to have it with you, someone I had just met, was actually really cool to me because typically, up until then, it was typically down with my family that I would be having my contact experiences with. So I was really excited to see that shift and transition. So I'm really glad you and I got to have that.
The one thing that I've noticed about it is, for people who understand, you and I are close, but we're not close. We don't talk every day, we don't talk every month, but when we need something, we're always there for each other. Does that kind of come along when you experience something this traumatic? And I am going to call it traumatic because, in all intents and purposes, it was.
Okay. I could definitely see how for you it was traumatic. For me, it was no offense, but decently mundane. But I do understand how for you, because of how intense the experience was and how life-changing, yeah, I could definitely see how that would be traumatic and very, very altering, which is exciting.
Well, for people who may not have heard yours and my story, I guess we should kind of get into it. It was April 15th, 2014. And 5 days previous to that, I had been called out of our friend's house with a UFO calling us that night. And we actually communicated with it. And when you first met me, I was kind of pacing around the house. I didn't really want to sit down. I wanted to go into the backyard, although I was kind of remiss because I wanted to learn a little bit more about who you were with a lifetime of ET contact. And you kind of reached out to me and you said, "You want to go outside, don't you?" And I was like, "Yeah, I totally want to go outside." And you and I ended up walking into the backfield of this farm, and I was showing you where the craft was. So for people who may not understand, you were able to actually pick up the energy of that craft from 5 days before.
Mhm. Yeah, it's very easy. Anyone who has more of a empathic or clairsentient sense as far as their psychic abilities are concerned is able to do that quite easily. An empath or a clairsentient is someone who's able to sense the vibratory fluctuations of the energetic fields located within people, objects, or within a location based upon the fluctuations and imbalances within an energy located at a specific place, which is awesome. But Dave, I think it's very important before you and I really get terribly started within this encounter and sharing it with others that we mention the fact that we had several dogs with us as well, accompanying us as we walk through the fields of our friend's property going towards the woods.
Yes, there were 4 dogs. The
Mhm.
property was about 10 acres, and the farm had 2 dogs, and I would bring my 2 dogs over to run around, and they were following us. And I remember you expressing concern before we walked into the forest on whether or not the dogs were going to cause any issues with that, because literally this is the conversation I remember was we were standing there and you kind of stopped me in the middle of the field and you said, Dave, do you want to go back in the forest? And immediately I knew what you were talking about. And I was like, what the hell? I just had this happen the other day. Why not? And then I remember you kind of had this coy look on your face, basically saying, we're probably going to see something. And I was
Mhm.
like, yeah, I know. And then you said something strange, which was, I don't know if we'll actually see anything because from what I know, ETs don't like dogs. And I don't know if we'll be able to see anything with the dogs, but we decided to walk in and the dogs ran into the forest beforehand. And then from there, and you could take it after this, from there, I remember you stopped me about 50 feet in, or pardon me, 50 yards into the forest, and you had this perplexed look on your face and you were looking around, and all you said was, Dave, where's the dogs? All 4 dogs were gone. Could not
Yeah,
see them.
I remember that because I stood up on a stump with me being so short, trying to look around, be like, where'd they go? Because I
Yeah.
mean, 4 dogs are pretty loud. We should be able to hear them breaking branches and running around and barking and being all crazy. Because these aren't all small dogs. There's only one small dog and 3 rather large dogs. So we should have been able to see them or at least hear them leave our area quite easily. But we didn't.
Yeah. So, we kept going because when dogs disappear in a forest, that's exactly what you do is you just keep going instead of turning around because there could be danger ahead. No, we kept going and we walked probably another 50 yards into the forest. And now for people understanding, this is 2 o'clock in the afternoon. This is a beautiful springtime blue sky. There's not a cloud in the sky. The weird part about it was there was not even any airplanes in the sky, which there usually was along that area.
Mhm.
And you stopped me again. And I will never forget this because this is where my life changed. You stopped me and you kind of, uh, you were real close. You were about only 18 inches from me. And you stopped me and you said, Dave, I don't want you to be afraid, but I want you to look that way. And you pointed north and you said, I want you to tell me what you see. And I remember taking a deep breath because I knew this was one of those now or never moments. And I took a deep breath and I turned, and all I could say for about the next couple minutes was, Samantha, what the F is that? Samantha, what the F is that? And there, 200 feet in front of us, I'm staring at a 10 to 12 foot extraterrestrial right in the middle of the forest, right in the middle of the day. And, I've often looked back at this, Samantha, with emotion, with anger, with fear, with happiness. And I honestly could say there's not a person on this planet that I would want to go through that moment with than you. And
Thank
you
you.
were the right person at the right time for me in this very traumatic part experience of my life. And, it was, to this day, I could, we're almost 9 years later, or pardon me, 6 years later, 7 years later, I can still feel the emotion from being in that forest. I could still feel your energy, the argument you and I had while we were standing there in the forest because you wanted to run up to the beings. But the one thing that we should preface, I only saw the one being, but there were 2
Mhm.
there. And I'll let you
Yes, there
take that.
were. Well, Dave, you have to remember from where I was standing, I was at a better vantage than you because I was up on a stump. But I was also able to look at them and see beyond the facade that they were projecting, because I was looking at them and seeing what they are in their true form, which is something I've asked many of the beings to do, was to show me what they look like in their state that is most comfortable for them. And the type of beings that we saw were a variety of Andromedan, in particular a brown, almost like a beautiful muddy brown kind of skinned Andromedan. They appeared to be naked. They did have larger eyes. They did have almond shaped eyes, quite beautiful beings. And one was slightly to the front and the other one was slightly behind. And they were wanting to communicate with us. They were actually wanting to have more contact, more initiation, but they were very concerned about you because they were looking at your energy level and your heart, and they're like, oh goodness, we don't want to take a heart attack. Which I remember getting down off the stump and starting to move forward, and you grabbed me by the arm and you're like, no, like, don't go, don't you dare leave me.
I remember saying to you at that point,
Yeah.
please don't leave me, because I was I remember it, and I'll admit to people at that point, the only thing that I had in my mind about ET contact was Travis Walton's Fire in the Sky. And I remember thinking, they're going to take her. I'm going to end up going back to the cabin or to the house alone. And now I'm going to have to explain how this girl that I just met 25 minutes previous is now missing. And I'm suspect number one.
Well, in all due fairness, they wouldn't have actually taken us anywhere, and if they did, they would have brought us back right away. They were very benevolent. They had no negative intentions in mind. I mean, the fact that they were looking at you and having the consideration of, okay, what is going on with this gentleman's health? Should we initiate contact again? Should we come back? Because they didn't want to create a medical emergency for you, even though they could have taken care of it. If they had done that and you had had a stroke or a heart attack, then of course that'd be counterproductive to what you're doing today, which is helping to share information to assist other people in waking up and to gaining more clarity about things going on within their own lives and other people's. So I can see why they acted the way they did and not stepping forward and saying, another time, we'll visit again.
See, and that's what screwed me up, though, because in my head, ETs
Mhm.
were bad. Everything extraterrestrial was bad.
Mhm.
Okay. I didn't know about the good ones. I mean, like I said, I'm referencing what happened from a Hollywood movie in Fire in
Mhm.
the Sky. And I really didn't know. And all of a sudden, so for people who are trying to picture this in their mind, Samantha is telepathically communicating with this one. And I remember you saying that they're not through them, that they're not here to harm us. They're not here to take us, but
Mhm.
we're more than welcome to come up and say hello.
Mhm.
However, they're very concerned about my health. Now, for
Yeah.
me personally, I was standing there and I was frozen. I was not, and I always like to preface this. I wasn't scared in the fact of what I was seeing. What I was scared of is I knew I'm 40 years old at this time, and everything in my life has just changed. There's now nothing normal about my life, because everything that I have been taught by my parents, my grandparents, my teachers, my coaches, my mentors, my bosses now meant nothing. Nothing. And that was the panic inside of me, because I wasn't prepared for what we were going to see. I thought I would be manly enough, and it's funny because now I laugh when people say, well, I would have taken a photo, or I would have grabbed a video, or I would have grabbed a picture. You are
No.
so that immediately I know you are full of crap when you're telling me this stuff, because you are not prepared. You have to be incredibly cold-hearted or cold-souled in order to be that prepared to say that you're going to do it, because when your eyes see something that your brain cannot comprehend, it messes with you. It
Well,
messes with you big time,
I
because
agree.
what we saw technically is not supposed to exist in current humanity, but yet there it was.
I agree with you completely. Most people, until they actually have these experiences, very similar to before you have children, you have no idea the complications and the difficulties of being a parent. The same thing can be said about contact with extraterrestrial, multidimensional, and various other types of beings out there, whether it's fairies, Bigfoot, whatever. You have no idea how you will react until you see them. And I wish more people would take that into consideration, that we perceive and we assume we would act one way, but in actuality, depending upon what we're like, how our natural aspects are within our soul, we will act a totally different way. I wanted to walk up to them and hug them, but I didn't want to leave you and then have you pass out. And that's a completely natural way, Dave. Like, please don't feel emasculated by that at all, because I wouldn't. For someone who didn't have contact up until that point, you actually handled it very well. So please view that as what it is, a very strong, logical, and decisive way of handling contact, especially with the way your mind worked and processed everything.
Why were they there at that moment?
Well, I had been encountering that group for a very long time, and they are one of the ones that I've been seeing physically quite often. They're a variety of Andromeda, and they're very nice. They're there because I have been asking for more physical contact, and they were simply showing me their support and love. And they were also doing the same thing with you, help me to awaken on your journey and to have an experience that would be so undeniable that it would force you onto a different trajectory. So, how exciting is that?
Well, it's exciting, but you know what? There's an anger part about it too, because
Hmm.
I've wanted it to happen again, and
Hmm.
it hasn't for me. Now,
And
I
I've
have had
offered to
other
go
things
camping.
happen. I've
Yeah.
had many other things happen. You know that because the minute something happens, I'm on the phone with you saying, "Ah, guess what happened to be that?" So, but on the flip side, that moment, that day, it was it was life altering. It was, it solidified an immediate lifelong friendship. Like
Hmm.
I feel glued to you as, I mean, I'm much older and much less pretty than you are, but I feel an absolute mentorship that I look up to you in regards to everything. And I feel um, very protective of you and very, very close to you that if, like if all of a sudden something happened and you needed me right there, I would drive up there and make sure that you were okay. Like I feel like almost like a bodyguard sort of thing. And I don't know whether that's a job that they gave me or if that's just because of the incident that really cool incident that happened. I'm not sure, but I know it changed my entire perspective and created a major bond that I have with you.
Well, I agree. But one thing you want to take into consideration with these things, Dave, is that when people allow themselves to go out into nature, many of the extraterrestrials and multidimensionals that are wanting to have interactions with these people have an easier time interacting with them and being less detected than if they were to try to have the same contact with those people in town or in a city. And so, for a lot of people, they do have very incredible and extraordinary experiences when they do go camping, whether it's driving up to the Yukon or going to the middle of nowhere up a mountain, because those beings don't have to put on cloaking. They don't have to hide their vibrational frequency as much. They can walk up towards you. As we've noticed within many of the cases of ufology, that the most prominent cases have occurred typically when those people are out of a city and in the middle of nowhere, and with good reason. Because they don't have to have the same protection measures in place to keep themselves, the ETs and multidimensionals, that is, safe.
So before we wrap this up, how do we make this happen again, Samantha? Because I want to have this happen again. I've been yearning for it. I think I'm mentally prepared for it. How do we make it happen?
We go camping.
Let's
Easy
go
peasy.
camping.
Well, good. I've been recommending for a couple of years we should. So
We'll do it this year. I
perfect.
promise. I
I love
promise. We'll
camping.
go out into nature. I'll let you pick the spot because you're a little bit better than that. And we'll get our families together. We'll make it happen. Samantha Mowat, thank you so much for coming on Beyond Humanity. You are an enlightening person in this entire field. I really think more people need to get to know you, your story, and your knowledge of this because the benefit you bring to the community is second to none.
Well, thanks, Dave. That's really sweet. And thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Absolutely. Samantha Mowat, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us on Beyond Humanity. I want to say to everyone, you can find us at uapresearch.com and on Twitter at UAPResearch. Find me at spacedoutradio.com and on Twitter at spacedoutradio.
And don't forget to look me up as well at www.samanthamowat.ca or to look me up at YouTube, Samantha Mowat. Perfect. Thank you so much.